There are always rumors that Israel was involved in the bombs in order to frighten the Iraqi Jews to leave the country. So I now have the smoking gun. It's a police report with details which only an insider could have had.
We recorded this interview about a month or so before the Hamas attacks from October 7th. If you watched the global news, you would be forgiven to think that the history of this conflict started at that very day, and most reporters who dared to venture to the other side started their interviews with the question, do you condemn the Hamas attacks?
But I find it much harder to respect a pro-Palestinian guest on my show if they simply resolutely refuse to say that they can condemn the terror attacks.
No matter how heartbreaking such an attack is, whether it occurs in Israel or in any of the other countries that struggle with terrorism, these events do not occur in isolation, which is exactly what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently has pointed out.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
And while the open promotion of genocide by politicians of all colors is currently applauded,
finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this, you know Iran's behind it, finish them.
Secretary General Guterres faced harsh criticism for his voice of reason.
Mr. Secretary General, in what world do you live? Definitely, this is not our world.
But if we really want to understand the situation and if we are serious about finding a solution other than genocide, then we have to look at the context in which tragic events such as the Hamas attacks take place. Putting things into context. That's exactly what Professor Avi Shlaim will do in the following interview. As a Jewish Arab, something that some consider to be an oxymoron, he and his family were driven out of their homeland Iraq by Jewish terror attacks directed against Jewish Arabs to frighten them into migrating to Israel. And what has all of this to do with today? Well, as you will see, Israel has a fundamental flaw built into its very DNA. As Tom Suarez has put it when I interviewed him not that long ago, even if there wouldn't be a single Palestinian living in Israel, Israel will self-destruct. If you think that's far-fetched, feel free to listen to this interview with Professor Avi Shlaim, where we discuss this and other controversial topics. And for those who are pressed for time or who simply want to pick and choose, I've left the timestamps below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to spread the news. It costs you nothing and helps this channel. Good, and here we go. Avi Shlaim, thank you so much for spending another morning with you. We already had an extensive interview, but we had agreed to focus on the topic of your book in this one. How's it going today? How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
To set the context just a little bit, as I just said, we already had a really interesting interview covering, in general terms, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in preparation of the first interview, I read your book, right? And it's called Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Now, we do not intend to make this a commercial for a book, yeah. But the story that you tell in that book as your memoirs is absolutely fascinating, and it makes it even more interesting because you merge your knowledge about an historian, and I could even be more specific, your knowledge as a new historian, and we can briefly describe what that is, with your personal experience and the experience and knowledge of your family, / your mother and your grandmother. Yeah. And I have to say, I read the book in about 2 or 3 days. It reads like a novel. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay. So this interview will not focus on the book, but it will focus on the story within the book. And I took some notes. Yeah. And what I would like to start with for you to explain, how come you mention Marilyn Monroe in the book And apparently she was discussing nationalism. So that would not be a topic that me as a stereotyped brained male would expect from Marilyn Monroe to talk about. So please tell us.
The quote from Marilyn Monroe comes from her scrapbook. And she wrote, nationalism stops us thinking. And I found that comment on nationalism very striking and illuminating, because my academic discipline is international relations. Nationalism is a big topic within international relations. It's crucial for war and peace. And I've read a great deal of literature on nationalism. The most famous is the book called Imagined Communities by Ben Anderson, which is always quoted everywhere. This theoretical literature was too abstract, and it didn't really resonate with my own experience, because I experienced nationalism when I was a new recruit into the Israeli army, the IDF, in 1964. I was 18 years old, and there was an induction in the twilight on a clearing on the Judean hills, and we all shouted, "By blood and fire, Judea fell. By blood and fire, Judea will rise again." And we swore loyalty to the motherland. We were prepared to sacrifice our lives for the motherland. So I felt nationalism in my bones, and the theoretical literature left me completely cold and indifferent. But Marilyn Monroe really had something profound to say, which is that nationalism stops us thinking, and nationalism stops us relating to the other side as human beings. And that's what conflict is all about. It's othering, and it's them and us, and it's black and white. We are good and they are evil. And Marilyn Monroe had an insight into this divisive and destructive, divisive and negative element of nationalism. And I know that her stereotype is that of a dumb blonde, but I have the highest respect for her as a profound thinker about international affairs.
And I think this quote comes off a book called Women in Dark Times. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
This is a book of essays by a very good friend of mine called Jacqueline Rose. She's a professor of English literature, and she's a feminist, and she combines English literature with psychoanalysis.
Okay. But if we go now to your story, the story that you described in your memoirs. Before I started to go on this journey with this deep dive into Israel's history, into contemporary problems, I was not aware, I even didn't think about that side of the story, right? That there's a second class of victims resulting from the physical creation of the state of Israel. Because you make a point very clear in your book. Prior to the creation of the state of Israel as a physical location, Arabs and Jews did not have any problems when it comes to living together. So maybe let's start there.
I also didn't think about the Jews in the Arab lands as victims of Zionism, because again, I come from the academic study of international relations, and my main research interest in the last 40 years or so has been the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there it was clear crystal clear that the main victim of Zionism are the Palestinians. The Zionist movement inflicted the Nakba on the Palestinians. In 1948, more than half the Arab population, around 750,000 Palestinians, became refugees. And the name Palestine was wiped off the map. So it was obvious that the Palestinians are the main victims of Zionism, but Zionist writers and Zionist leaders used to still blame the Palestinians. And this is blaming the victims for their own misfortunes. So in my work as a historian, I try to redress the balance and say that the Palestinians were not, they are the victims and they are not responsible for their own misfortunes. Their misfortunes were imposed on them by Israel, by Britain, by some of the Arab countries. But it's only much more recently, when I started working on my memoir, that I realized that there was another category of victims who are hardly ever talked about, and that is the Jews who lived in Arab countries, for the most part lived in harmony with their environment, a good life, and they were also, their traditional style of life as Arab Jews was completely disrupted by the 1948 Arab-Israeli war and by the creation of the State of Israel. They now became outsiders or foreigners in their own land. And so that's when I began to focus on this other category of victims of Zionism. And here too, I drew inspiration from a woman. I've already mentioned two women who inspired me, Marilyn, Monroe, and Jacqueline Rose. Now I'll mention another woman, Ella Shohat. She's an Israeli of Iraqi origins who is a professor at New York University, a very eminent cultural critic, and she's in particular a critic of Zionism. And she has a brilliant collection of essays called The Arab Jew, Palestine, and Other Displacements. It's a collection of essays from which I learned a huge amount because the concept of an Arab Jew is pivotal to her whole analysis of the history of the Middle East. So she asserts this category of people, of Arab Jews, Jews who lived in Arab countries, and they were both Arab and Jewish at the same time. And this shouldn't be very controversial, but it was in Israel, and it is in Israel, because Israelis say that it's a contradiction in terms, that it's an ontological impossibility. If you're a Jew, you cannot be an Arab, and if you're an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. That's one thing about Ella Shohat's work. The other theme that was very relevant to me was displacement. So the Palestinians were displaced from Palestine and became refugees. This was a very traumatic thing for them, and there is a literature about the displacement and its consequences, what it is like to live in exile. And then she draws a parallel between Arab Jews, specifically Iraqi Jews, where her parents came from, and how we were displaced from our homeland and ended up in a new country which was alien to us, culturally and linguistically alien to us, the state of Israel. And it's very, very striking, the parallel histories, which is denied by Zionists. The Zionists say the Palestinians left of their own free will, of their own accord, or on orders from their leaders. So the Arabs are responsible for the Palestinian refugee problem. But on the other hand, the Jews of the Arab countries were expelled by the Arab governments. So they are real refugees. And there is a Zionist theory of the double exodus, that the Palestinians left, and then 800,000 Jews from Arab countries ended up in Israel. So it was a population exchange. I completely deny it. I say the Palestinians were refugees and Israel expelled them. But this led me to look at the parallels between Palestinian history and the history of the Arab Jews.
You said quite a number of things. So I think I need to clarify a couple of things. So as we discussed in the first interview, you are one of a handful of people. I think it's even less than a handful. It's Benny Morris, it's Ilan Pappe, it's you. I don't know if there are more, which are so-called new historians. And why is that? Because you gentlemen had the rare opportunity in the 1980s, early 1990s, to access Israel's state archives, which since then have been closed. I mean, access as academics, as researchers, since then have been closed. And this is where you draw your conclusions from that you have published, and I think to some degree have been also criticized for. So two things that I definitely would like to come back to later on is the Lavon affair in combination, of course, with those terrorist bomb attacks in Baghdad, for example. Yeah, so that's definitely on the list here. Yeah, but most and foremost, and I think that's what makes your story so interesting. You are one of them. You are one of those people that you're talking about personally. Yeah, your whole family was affected by that move, and I would like to outline one specific point which you made in your book, right? Why was it that the mere fact that the state of Israel as physical location was created, that this fact undermined the relation between non-Jewish Arabs and Jewish Arabs in countries like, for example, Iraq, but also other countries? Why was that?
It is because Zionism is a nationalist movement. And as Marilyn Monroe pointed out, nationalism stops people thinking about other people as human beings. So Isaiah Berlin, the Jewish philosopher, used to like to say that the Jews are like any other people, only more so. And by the same token, Zionist historiography is like any other nationalist historiography, only more so. So all national movements rewrite their history in a way that is flattering to them and very derogatory about their enemies. And this is what the Zionist movement did. It created hostility between Israel and its neighbors. Obviously, they were at war in 1948, but also there were repercussions to the rest of the Arab world because there were Jews there who had been natives, who had been part of the local society, part of the environment, an integral part. They were integrated into local Arab society. But after 1948, they were regarded increasingly as outsiders, as the allies and the friends and brothers of the Zionist movement in Israel. So that's when there was a huge increase in hostility towards the Jews in Iraq, and in other Arab countries as well. So the establishment of the State of Israel didn't change just the geopolitics of the region. It did that. It was a major turning point in the history of the region, but it had far-reaching consequences for the Jewish minorities in Arab and Islamic countries.
Yeah, and we talk about minorities, but in your case, there were like 120,000 Arab Jews in Iraq, and within a relatively short time, they were, I cannot say expelled, because they left supposedly on their free will. Yeah, but maybe we briefly talk about the Lavon affair and because this is one of the controversies that your book, the latest book here, your memoirs, has actually caused. I did some research. You were quite criticized and attacked for the facts that you mentioned here in the book concerning certain terrorist attacks in Baghdad, which can be compared to the Lavon affair in Egypt.
So there is a whole chapter in my book which is called Baghdad Bombshell, and that relates to the year 1950, when the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so, and they have a year to register. And not many Jews chose to up sticks and move out. In the course of that year, there were 5 attacks on Jewish sites in Baghdad, and that precipitated and accelerated the exodus. The number of more and more Jews registered to leave the country, and eventually left the country to go to Israel. It's not part of my argument that the bombs were the main reason for the exodus, but it's a factor, and it's a very controversial factor in Israel. There are always rumors that Israel was involved in the bombs in order to frighten the Iraqi Jews to leave the country. This rumor was always denied. There were 2 commissions of inquiry which exonerated Israel from any involvement. But the rumors persisted, and I, as a historian, wanted to get to the bottom of this story. And eventually I did. I interviewed a few years ago an elderly Jew, Iraqi Jew, a friend of my mother's, called Yaakov Karkukli, who was in the Zionist underground. And he told me about their activities, about how they used to forge documents, forge passports, visas, and how they used to pay bribes to officials to get Jews out of the country to go to Israel. But most importantly, he told me that one of his colleagues, Yosef Basri, was responsible for 3 of the 5 bombs. Not all of them, 3 out of the 5. And he also told me that his controller was an Israeli intelligence officer called Max Binet, who was based in Tehran, because these were the days of the Shah and the covert cooperation between the Shah's Iran and the newly born state of Israel. So the intelligence officer could operate from Tehran, and he was the controller of Yosef Basri. Yosef Basri was caught, and his assistant, Shalom Saleh Shalom. They were tortured, they confessed, and they were tried and condemned to death by hanging. Now, Israel continued to deny that they had anything to do with it. They said that they were they were tortured and forced to confess. But it was true that they were tortured, but it doesn't mean that they were innocent. They were responsible, and they weren't accused of all 5 bombs, but only the ones that they were responsible for. Now, apart from the oral evidence that I had from Kirkukli, he also gave me a Baghdad police report. It's 1 page with details of the interrogation and what Basri and Shalom said in the interrogation. So I now have the smoking gun. It's a police report with details which only an insider could have had. No one could have known all these details about what was said in the interrogation. But I took this investigation a step further. I got in touch with an Iraqi journalist in Baghdad who had written a book some years ago. His name is Shamil Abdelkader. His book in Arabic was called The Zionist Movement and the Migration of the Jews from Iraq, 1950-1951. And I sent him the 1-page report that I have, which doesn't have a date or a letterhead or a subject. It's plain paper. And I said to him, "Is this genuine?" And he said to me, "Yes, it is genuine. It's from a comprehensive police report on the interrogation, which is 258 pages long. This is not just 1 page from the report, it's information drawn from different parts of the report, but it's completely genuine. So I've now concluded that Basri and his assistant, under the direction of an Israeli intelligence officer, planted 3 bombs in Baghdad in order to accelerate the departure of the Jews. So I no longer have any doubt that Israel was involved in the bombings. And that's quite a serious indictment. The next point I want to make is that this particular false flag operation wasn't a one-off, but it was typical of the pattern of behavior of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was a very single-minded and ruthless movement which only cared about creating a Jewish state in Palestine and didn't care about the fate of the Jews anywhere else. This is where the Lavon affair comes in. The Lavon affair takes its name after Pinchas Lavon, who was Israeli Minister of Defense in 1954. And there was an Israeli intelligence officer who recruited a group of Egyptian Jews, and they were spies and saboteurs for Israel, operating under his direction. And they planted bombs in public places. And the purpose of the bombs was to strain the relations between the Nasser regime. This is 2 years after the revolution, when the free officers came to power, to strain relations between the Nasser regime and the West. And Britain still had bases in the Suez Canal and had reached agreement with the Nasser regime to withdraw from the Suez Canal base. And the Israelis wanted the British imperialists to remain in control and to frustrate the Arab-Egyptian desire for liberation, for freedom, for getting rid of Western presence. So Israel was trying to create to strain the relations, to create mistrust between the West and this regime. But The operation went bad. It went badly. One bomb exploded, or smoke started coming out in a cinema, and the whole group were rounded up and tried and put in prison, including the controller of this spy ring. His name was Max Binet. It's the same man who was responsible for the second false flag operation. And Max Binet committed suicide in prison. And no one denies that this was a real operation directed by Israel, but they still deny that the bombs in Baghdad were that Israel was involved in them. So I conclude that this was not just a one-off false flag operation, but it's typical of the behavior of what one person called cruel Zionism. It's not my term, but I can't think of a better way to describe these two terrorist organizations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is much more evidence coming from your colleagues, amongst others from the New Historians, that overall, and these terror attacks were not restricted to Arab countries or Israel under the mandate. I said it in the other interview. Even the Hotel Sacher in Vienna was bombed. Right, the Zionist movement even tried to assassinate Winston Churchill. So it's not a localized event. Yeah, what I would like to explore a little bit with you is still that when your family, let's keep it very personally, yeah, but also when a number of other Arab Jews migrated or were more or less forced to migrate by circumstances to Israel, there were more fortunate ones like your family, and which you describe in a book, but then also the less fortunate. And there was one significant event that really caused resentment about the people who emigrated towards Israel, namely that from one day to the other, it was apparently agreed behind the scenes that the wealth and the resources of the emigres would remain in Iraq, right? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I can. As I mentioned earlier, in March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law that said that any Jew who wants to leave the country can leave within a year, register to leave within a year, to leave on a one-way visa, laissez-passer. They wouldn't be able to return. Once they've made the decision, they had to leave and they couldn't go back. The law didn't say anything about their property, but at the end of the year, after the year had expired, the Iraqi government passed a second law which said any Iraqi Jew who relinquished the citizenship thereby forfeited any rights that they had as Iraqi citizens. That meant they lost everything. The houses were confiscated, the cars, the businesses, and the bank accounts were frozen. So overnight, they became penniless. And the bulk of the Jews who ended up in Israel were penniless. They came by plane to Israel with one suitcase and 50 dinars. That's all they were allowed to take out. And then there were rumors that Israel had struck a deal with the Iraqi government. According to this story, the Iraqi government said, we cannot allow the Jews to leave because they are a central pillar of the Iraqi economy. And if the Jews leave with all their wealth, the Iraqi economy would collapse. And according to this story, the Israeli government said okay, we want the people, we don't need their wealth, So just let the people go. And according to this theory, there was a secret agreement between David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister, and Nuria Said, the Iraqi prime minister, that the Iraqis would let the Jews go, but keep their wealth. I was interested, and I tried to investigate this story, but I couldn't find any evidence of an actual deal. So I couldn't just repeat it as if it was true when I haven't got any evidence. So I just reported the rumors, and I reported that I have not been able to find any evidence to substantiate this theory of collusion between the two governments.
But the fact remains, right, that overnight, basically, it was decided that if you had already registered, even if you were still in Iraq, right,
Yes.
and you had registered to move out, you lost everything.
Yes. This was the most terrible blow to the Jews, and many of them had registered but had not left. So they still lost everything, and they were in a state of limbo, and there was nowhere for them to go except to go to Israel, completely penniless.
You said it already, or I mentioned it. Your family was fortunate because you had British passports, or part of your family had British passports. But the bulk of the emigres were not so fortunate. Can you tell us a little bit about how they were received in Israel, starting with the DDT dusting?
Israel arranged for transport of the Jews from Iraq to come to Israel. And when they arrived at the airport in Israel, they arrived at the promised land, they were sprayed with DDT, which is a chemical that you use to spray animals. And this was the most terrible shock. That was how they were received in the promised land. So it was a very bad start to life in the new country. It was very insensitive to do that to them. And then they were taken to transit camps. A transit camp is called Ma'abara in Hebrew, or Ma'abarot for the plural. And they were taken to transit camps, and there were tents or shacks. The hygiene was of very, very poor quality. The food was of very poor quality, and there was no employment. Conditions were really dire for the great majority. And this was the whole of the Jewish community in Iraq. Nearly 120,000 Iraqi Jews ended up in Israel and in transit camps. And it included writers, academics, doctors, lawyers, accountants, journalists, but they all received the same very poor treatment. And also the managers of the Ma'abarot were Ashkenazi Jews who knew nothing about these people. They knew nothing about their status in their own country, their education, their achievements, and they treated them as refugees fleeing persecution. And they thought that these poor people should be grateful for what they were getting instead of complaining. So there were tensions from the start between the existing Ashkenazi Jews and the newcomers from the Arab countries. And these tensions persist to this day.
I just wanted to ask, coincidentally, today I have published my interview with the former Israeli ambassador, Lavon, right? And I discussed the topic of Ashkenazi Jews versus Sephardic Jews with him. he was a bit more nuanced here. Huh? But you just said it. So there was the split from very briefly. So the Ashkenazi Jews were the Jews from, let's say, European descent, right? And the Sephardic Jews from Oriental descent. So there was this kind of split. And if I understand correctly, then the Sephardic Jews are more inclined to be observant Jews, whereas Ashkenazi Jews, do I pronounce this correctly? I always break my tongue. Ashkenazi Jews.
Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi. Okay.
Ashkenazi.
Apologize. Yeah. Which are more the secular Jews. Right.
Yeah.
So then I asked Ambassador Haim, so are there frictions within the Israeli society which come to light now throughout these demonstrations against the judiciary reform? Because in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, you have 15 judges, 13 of which are of Ashkenazi descent, right? So you just said it, those frictions continue to this day. Yeah, but how strong are those frictions really? Because when I look at those demonstrations in Israel, which are happening now still every Saturday, all I see, I mean, from an image, those are the Europeans. I don't see ultra-Orthodox, or I haven't seen any, I mean, not one or two even demonstrating there. So is this really a demonstration or a demarcation line which is now visible through those demonstrations between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews?
Israel was established by Jews from Europe, Ashkenazi Jews. And from the beginning, they were the elite. They were the political elite, the cultural elite, the military elite. There was a hierarchy within the Ashkenazi community. German Jews were considered the most superior of the Ashkenazi Jews. And below the Ashkenazi levels of society, there were the Sephardi Jews, the Oriental Jews. And here again, there was a hierarchy. And Iraqi Jews were the best educated, the wealthiest, the most successful at adjusting. So they were the top. Whereas Moroccan Jews, who were mostly uneducated and became manual laborers, they were the bottom of the pile, and they always felt that they were discriminated against. So Israel was a very hierarchical society, and as a schoolboy in Israel, I always felt that the Ashkenazis were superior, that this was the natural order of things, that I was an Iraqi boy and therefore I was inferior, and I had a chip on my shoulder. I had an inferiority complex that defined my relationship with Israeli society, and I didn't overcome this sense of inferiority until long after I had left Israel and had a different perspective. So these are very deep cleavages in Israeli society that persist to this day. What is interesting and what is important for Israeli politics is that many of the Oriental Jews vote for the Likud and for right-wing parties, and also for the religious parties, particularly Shas, which is a religious party of Oriental Jews. And the question is, why should these Jews who came from Arab countries vote for nationalist parties in Israel? The Israeli answer is that these people lived with Arabs. They know what Arabs are like. They know that you can't trust Arabs. They know that Arabs only respect the language of force. That's why they vote for nationalist parties. My explanation for this phenomenon is that it's in Israel that the Oriental Jews were indoctrinated to hate, to see the Arabs as the enemy. And in order to establish their credentials as good Israelis, nationalist Israelis, they vote for right-wing anti-Arab parties. But whatever the explanation is, this is a very deep division within Israeli society, Ashkenazis and Sephardi Jews, and another cleavage, which was there from the start, is between the religious Jews and the secular Jews. And as you said, the Ashkenazi Jews are predominantly secular, but the proportion of religious Jews has been steadily increasing, and so has the political influence. And now we have, in Netanyahu's government, we have Itamar Ben-Gvir, of Kurdish Iraqi origins, who is extreme right-winger and racist and Jewish supremacist. And you have Bezalel Smotrich, who is equally extreme and racist and homophobic. So the Israeli electorate has been changing more and more. A higher proportion of religious Jews, the number of religious Jews has been increasing. And it's partly because religious Jews have a higher birth rate than secular European Jews. So that is an important demographic factor which is shaping Israeli society and explains why the present government is the most right-wing, xenophobic, chauvinistic, and overtly racist government in Israel's entire history.
It's interesting to see that in the case of Ben-Gvir, right, that an Arab basically is so against other Arabs in the extreme. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of J. Edgar Hoover, who himself apparently had a gay relationship, was prosecuting all the gay, was really prosecuting gay people in America, right? But I have a couple of minutes. We have a couple of minutes left. I would like to ask you one thing. I have not spoken, I have not interviewed Ilan Pappe yet, but I have interviewed Benny Morris. So when you compare your own views, and I'm not talking about publications, book, research papers, that's not what I'm talking about, yeah? If you compare your own views with the views of Benny Morris, where's the difference? Because I know there are differences.
The differences increased over time. But in 1988, Benny Morris published his book on the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem. Ilan Pappe published his book on Britain and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I published my book, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. The three of us became collectively known as the Revisionist Israeli Historians, or the New Historians, because between us we challenged all the myths that surrounded the birth of Israel in the First Arab-Israeli War, and we are all on the left. Ilan Pappe was the most radical anti-Zionist. Benny Morris was the most mild, moderate Zionist, and I was somewhere in the middle. But over the years, I've moved further in the direction of Ilan Pappe, in that I've increasingly questioned the Zionism, the Zionist movement, and Israel's legitimacy, especially beyond the Green Line, the Zionist colonial project beyond the Green Line. So where we began, Benny Morris and I began to differ, before I turned to that, we were all three of us did our PhDs in British universities. We were all trained as historians in Britain. We use the usual canons of historical scholarship. Benny Morris was more of a purist than Ilan and myself. He was a positivist historian. He only believed in written evidence, whereas I used oral history in order to supplement the written evidence. But he was a purist. He would only go by written records, and he's a very good historian. He's a very good researcher, and he gathered so much material on this issue of the Palestinian refugees, and he's the expert on the subject. And he didn't pass any moral judgments. He just described what happened in 48, phase by phase, village by village, in great detail what happened, and he didn't pass judgments. Where he began to change his views is after the Second Intifada, which broke out in the year 2000, and the suicide bombs. And I think that the suicide bombs destabilized him, that you got on a bus and you didn't know whether the bus would be blown up. You go to a cafe and you don't know whether a bomb will explode in the cafe. And I think that destabilized Benny Morris psychologically, and it led him to revise fundamentally his understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he now came to the conclusion that the Arabs are to blame. Only the Arabs are to blame. Israel is not to blame. And this was an existential conflict. The Arabs, the Palestinians, don't want just the West Bank and Gaza. They want everything. And therefore, this is an existential conflict. He came very close to saying that transfer, mass expulsion, could be justified under certain circumstances. And that's the parting of the way between Benny Morris and me, because looking back at 1948, he says, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And I say, you have to distinguish between a legitimate war of resistance to Arab aggression and war crimes against civilians. You don't have to justify them. You can say Israel was created in war, and Israel is a legitimate country, but you shouldn't then go and justify crimes against civilians. Killing civilians is wrong, period. That's where he and I differ. But the difference is wider than that, because Benny Morris said that the Oslo Accord of 1993 was a mistake, because the Palestinians are liars, and they wouldn't settle for a small Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. They have the theory of stages. This is stage one, but then stage by stage, they would want to take over the whole country. So his explanation of why the Oslo process broke down is that the Palestinians are liars and you can't trust them. And my explanation of why the Oslo peace process broke down is that after the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, after the Likud came back to power in 1996, under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel went back on the deal, and Israel started expanding settlements on a massive scale. And and if you press me to explain the collapse of the Oslo peace process in one word, the cause of the collapse in one word, that word would be settlements, Jewish settlements on the West Bank, because you can't pretend to be going towards peace with the Palestinians and stealing more and more of their land. It's one or the other. And since 1967, Israel had a choice of land or peace. Since the Oslo Accord was signed, it's very clear, it's crystal clear that Israel prefers land to peace with the Palestinians. That's where Benny Morris and I differ. He says the Palestinians are responsible for the political deadlock, and I say no, it's Israel which is responsible for not following up on the promise of the Oslo Accord.
Avi, you have been very generous with your time last time. I don't want to overstay my welcome too much. 2 or 3 minutes. I have 1 or 2 little things. Yeah, I just opened something that I came across. There's a movie, there's a documentary called Tantura, and I believe that's the name of a village. And it was made by Halal Gabriel Yahaya. Are you aware of that film, about this documentary?
I am aware of the film, and it was screened in London recently by the International Lawyers for Palestine, and I was on a panel to discuss the film. This is an important episode in the new history because there was a student in Haifa University who wrote his MA thesis on Tantura. Tantura was a massacre that was carried out in Tantura, a village north of Haifa by the sea, in May 1948. The claim of the thesis is that there was a cold-blooded massacre of the villagers. And this became very controversial and highly politicized. And Teddy Katz, the author of this thesis, was sued for libel by the veterans of the Alexandroni Brigade. And in court, under pressure, he recanted and he apologized to them. And then the university appointed new examiners who found professional defects in his work, and he was his MA was taken away from him, but the controversy continued around the Tantura affair, and Ilan Pappe was one of his main defenders. But as far as the new history is concerned, it didn't do any good to us collectively as historians because of the defects in this thesis, and people tended to say, well, the new history is biased and is defective, but in fact, Teddy Katz is only responsible for what he's written. Benny Morris is only responsible for what he has written. The same is true of myself and of Ilan Pappe. But the notion of new history no longer really exists. Only older people know what new history is, because it's a phenomenon of the late 1980s and early 1920s. And the decade of Oslo gave a huge boost to the new history. Because there was a peace agreement with the Palestinians, Israelis were encouraged to look critically at their past and to admit past mistakes. But with the collapse of the process and the start of the second Intifada, Israelis reverted to fundamentalist positions of us against them. So the new history became much less popular, and then it was discredited to some extent by the Teddy Katz affair. And today people no longer talk about the new history, but in historical perspective, it did fulfill an important function. And Edward Said said this at a conference. He said, the new history is valuable for 3 reasons. It's valuable at 3 levels. First, it educated the Israelis about the Palestinian side in this conflict. Secondly, it encouraged young Palestinian scholars to look critically at their own leadership in 1948 and its mistakes. And a good example is Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian historian, who has written really important books on the history. And thirdly, the new history created a political climate in which it was possible for the peace process to go forward. So the new history did play a positive role in Israeli society and outside, but it's a thing of the past rather than something that is relevant today to the debate about Israel-Palestine today.
I will definitely have a look out for Tantura if the movie comes here into the Netherlands. Yeah. Now, Avi Shlaim, one last thing. I would like to come back to your book. I said already it was readable like a novel. And with this, I mean specifically the way you wrote it, it created images in my mind. I could virtually see the house that you described that your father built, right? I could see the environment. I could really feel the social integration, right? So my question to you is, do you know what happened to the house? Have you ever been back?
No, but I know where the house is. And when the Ba'ath came to power under Saddam Hussein, they changed the street names. So the name of the street has probably changed, but I know the neighborhood, Batawin neighborhood, which was a fairly wealthy neighborhood and a mixed neighborhood with Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So I probably would be able to locate it, and I'm hoping to go back to Israel. Sorry, I'm hoping to visit Iraq with my family, especially now that there's going to be an Arabic edition of 3 Worlds. There's also going to be a Hebrew edition, but there will be an Arabic edition. And my daughter, who has never been to Iraq, of course, and my wife are very keen for us to go as a family and to visit Iraq. So that's the plan for the future.
I wish you all the best if you do so. I hope you will find your house, hoping that it's still there, that it's still standing, right, after all those years.
Thank you, Thomas. It's been a pleasure to talk to you again.
Likewise, Avi Shlaim, thank you so much for your generous time that you spent with me now the second time. Best wishes from Amsterdam to the UK, to the rainy UK.
Thank you, and good day to you and to all the listeners.